Hi, welcome to a training on suicide prevention for youth. The training you're about to hear and see will be focused on suicide prevention in scouting, but could be applicable to any youth leadership role. As you watch this video, make sure you have someone in mind that you could reach out to if this topic or anything I say along the way upsets you. Because we'll be focusing on what to do, not on how bad the problem is, that's not likely. But I can't predict what statement might trigger a memory or feeling, so feel free to pause the video and make sure you have a plan for making sure you're okay. In fact, you may want to be ready to pause this video at any time just to make note of something you find useful, or if you think of questions or feedback that you'd like to send to me. My email address is on the first and last slides. Now, if I've done this right, you should be able to see the PowerPoint I have, which for those attending the Institute will be also emailed to you as a PDF of these slides. So I'm Jim Foley. I'm the Director of Community Education and Prevention at the Counseling Center of Wayne and Holmes counties in Ohio. I understand we have people attending this training from a variety of locations and even outside the United States, which is one of the benefits of doing these trainings online. In my work, I do suicide prevention training of youth themselves and how to recognize signs of suicide risk or potential risk in their peers and how to take action. And I train a lot of teachers, youth leaders, and other adults in these skills. So you'll be benefiting from those trainings I've done. I also supervise school-based counselors and was a former school-based counselor myself, as well as working with youth and families as a therapist in the past. I gave a talk on this topic at this same institute for Scout leaders last year. I did get to interact with an audience there and see your reactions, address your questions. I'll try to use some of that experience today to anticipate questions that you may have as you're watching this. If you did attend that last year, there will be lots of new material today. So our mission, our goal in this workshop today, to help you feel ready for situations where you might be with someone who has some of the warning signs that we'll be talking about. Now, feeling ready is partly about skills. We'll be reviewing some of the skills today I just talked about training other people in, recognizing and responding to early warning signs of future suicide risk. Being ready is also about willingness to take action. In fact, that's sort of a definition of courage, is being willing to take action even when you're not comfortable. So I don't expect you at the end of this training to necessarily feel comfortable. I could say, even as a clinician with lots of experience dealing with suicidal people, I might not be totally comfortable and relaxed. I try to use some of the stress to help me focus rather than feeling stressed out so that it paralyzes me. But I encourage you, I ask you to dive in to paying attention to and assisting youth who may be at risk, even if you don't feel sure of what you're doing. I hope you'll feel a little bit more sure at the end of this training today. So part of what I'm asking you to do is to be a cop. By my definition here of being courageous, by the definition we just talked about, being open-minded, open and receptive to the youth's experience rather than focusing on what you want to provide to them or say to them, focus on what you want to hear from them, and feeling prepared. And preparedness in this case is planning. It's useful to use a training like this to think in advance of how you will handle something, because under the stress of being in the situation, we sometimes don't make the best decisions. An example I like to use in some of my trainings is if a bee is flying around you, you might be tempted to swat at the bee. Even though you know it might make you more likely to get stung, it's an instinct. A lot of times, under the stress of an interpersonal situation, like being in the company of a youth with emotional issues that you don't understand or feel ready to deal with, you might do things that are not helpful because it's your instinct. There'll be a section in the second half of this that I call temptations and tips, the things that we're tempted to say and my tips of what to do instead. So hopefully you can use this time to plan what you'll do in those stressful situations, just as you would with a bee, to plan to walk in a straight line away, maybe hold your breath in case your breath is attracting the insects, anything but swatting at them to make you more likely to get stung. You may wonder whether suicide prevention should be part of your job as a scout leader or other youth leader. And I would argue that you may have the most important role of all. You are seeing kids that counselors are not seeing. Maybe not seeing yet, maybe they won't see them at all. Counselors do help people who are already in counseling, but people like you are part of how they get there by having someone notice signs of risk, of difficulty that is more than just friendship or regular adult support can help with, and work in the ways that we'll talk about at the very end of getting people linked to services. You may also be in a position to catch it earlier before it gets to the point of a crisis where a counselor needs to be called in. So we'll be talking about how to help youth who may not be at risk of suicide today, but may be at risk 2 years down the line if someone didn't intervene now. And related to my understanding of the scouting oath, its aims, its methods, it's part of your role to keep kids safe and healthy and growing and developing. And it's part of your role to lead by setting an example, by encouraging independence and strengths in your youth. And all of that is part of preventing youth from being on the path to suicide. You may wonder how often it's going to come up that I might need to use these skills. Obviously, I hope as little as possible, but I also want you to be prepared. As far as a suicidal crisis where youth is at risk today, they're on the verge of suicide, and this can happen even in your youngest Cub Scouts. This might be just as rare or almost as rare as any situation putting the youth at severe risk of harm. Maybe not that often that they'll be in that intense of a crisis. You might never see a youth in that severe, intense crisis where they need to be attended to today to keep them safe, to keep them alive. But as far as how often you'll see some warning signs that indicate that someone might be on the path to eventual suicide risk, I would think you would at least be in the company of that and hopefully see it every season in every troop, pack, and patrol. It unfortunately is common, not as common as anxiety in your youth. Anxiety is another training that I'll be doing, but depression and suicide risk does happen as well. A model I'm going to be talking to you about to help you be prepared for helping youth who might be at risk is sharpening your saw. That's a good model for preparedness in general, that we do well to execute a task when we spend some time, some breaks preparing to execute that task. The saw in this case is your senses, what you notice, including warning signs, what you watch for, your attitudes, like the openness I mentioned earlier, also being patient, being curious, flexible, accepting. By accepting, I don't mean saying that everything you hear is okay with you, but acknowledging what you see. Accepting here means the opposite of denial, being respectful, and focusing more on empathy than sympathy, focusing on tuning in rather than feeling bad, pitying them. Then finally, a big bulk of today of your saw will be the words that you say and the words that you hear, how to have the conversation with youth based on the warning signs that we'll be talking about. I am not an expert on scouting oath law, uh, but I thought I would introduce some of that here to try to dovetail what we're talking about with scouting principles. I notice in the scouting oath, it talks about the need to be mentally awake. Sometimes depression and other mental health issues can cloud our thinking, can make it hard to be mentally awake. Your conversation with the youth can help with that. That's part of what counseling and therapy does, is make their thoughts even more clear so that they can sort them out, make their feelings more clear to them, what's happening in their body more clear. But any conversation, including the ones that I'm recommending with my temptations and tips section, can be part of helping youth be mentally awake. Scout law includes being cheerful and brave. Obviously, if you're depressed, it's hard to be cheerful. And I don't recommend encouraging youth to fake being cheerful. That's a common mistake, a sad mistake, unfortunately related to cases of suicide that I know of in my area of Ohio, where people that ended up ending their lives felt like they had to be cheerful, that they had to be strong by denying their feelings, putting on a happy face, and eventually got to the point where they felt their only option was to not live anymore to escape the pain, because they didn't see the option of bringing it to the surface and letting other people help them engage with that pain. So even though cheerfulness is a value, even more important for mental health purposes and for survival is facing your emotions, taking a longer path to that cheerfulness, not whitewashing and putting on a mask and, and faking it. So here's another definition of bravery or courage, is facing those feelings. It's harder to face uncomfortable feelings in someone else or in yourself than to just pretend it isn't there. So not every mental and emotional challenge necessarily needs counseling or even your intervention. Some, Sometimes stress, sadness, irritation, aggravation happens, and getting through those experiences with or without help can strengthen us. In our adult role, we can step back and let that happen and not be overprotective, not intervene too much or be too meddling, but be a resource available to help, be a role model by sometimes showing our own struggles and how we manage them, and providing a guide to healthy coping. But sometimes mental health challenges, conditions, feelings get stuck, where they're not just a reaction anymore. I have in mind an analogy that if you're out of breath because you just ran a race, that may seem extreme, but it's just a reaction that just needs to subside on its own. But if you're out of breath because you have asthma or bronchitis, that's a condition. It may not be an emergency, but it may need attention, treatment, or an assessment first if it's the first time it's being diagnosed. That's kind of like the distinction between sadness and depression, where sadness is a reaction. You're usually sad about something, but depression is an ongoing condition where it's not about something anymore. So if you are with someone who feels down, sad, blank, empty, and they don't know why, and then nothing bad has happened in their life, it can be tempting to think that there's no reason for this feeling shouldn't be there, but that's exactly when it's depression, when it's not about something anymore. So the problem with these kind of ongoing stuck conditions is that they don't tend to just get better with time unless they have support or intervention or safety. Just as a wound doesn't necessarily heal on its own if it's bad enough unless it has protection and treatment. So therapy is like that safety and treatment. So the warning signs that I'm asking you to pay attention to. We'll start with some feelings. There's lots of emotions and feelings that can be related to suicide risk. I'm going to focus on a few major mindsets that are the most related to suicide risk. One is worthlessness, or a related situation where you don't feel a sense of belonging, or your attempt to belong to a group has been thwarted, or even going so far as to hate yourself. Here, we're not talking about just being down on one aspect of yourself, like you're not as athletic or skilled or smart as other people. This is when feeling like your whole self is of no value. Ironically, this can happen sometimes in youth that are achieving well, that are well liked, that have a lot of skills and performance if they feel valued only for those traits where they're excelling and not for who they are as a person. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about risk factors. About this lack of belonging, it can show up even when someone is part of a group. If they feel like their participation in that group is sort of fake, they're putting on an act, so they're not really being liked for who they are. Or if they get rejected from that group based on some aspect of who they are that's very important. And these are the forms of bullying that are the most hurtful, is when that strikes at the core of who someone is. Then it's more likely to make them be internalized, not just embarrassed about some trait that's easily visible, but feeling like who I am is no good. And this is especially a risk in youth who are likely to adopt what other people are saying about them as the right way of viewing things, especially if it's adults or their peers. So don't mistake being part of a group as having a sense of belonging with that group. Another major kind of feeling that's a risk factor for suicide is hopelessness or tunnel vision. Now, in our rural areas, tunnels don't come up very often, but they do happen going through mountains. And often you have this expression, there's light at the end of the tunnel. But when you're depressed, you don't feel there's light at the end of the tunnel. You feel there's doom at the end of the tunnel. And in a tunnel, there are no exits. You can't turn around easily. So if you feel like all that's ahead of you is doom and there's no way to avoid heading towards it, you may want to stop going forward, which for someone with depression who has this sense of hopelessness about what's ahead, not going forward means not living anymore. So if you hear statements like, this is never going to get better, that maybe you may want to clarify whether that means that they genuinely don't feel that life is going to get better. And this is a mistake that's also, like hopelessness or like worthlessness, something that's more of a risk for youth than it is for adults. Because by the time you're, say, 35 or so, you've probably had some time in your life when you felt really bad, when your situation was really bad, and you felt sure that it wasn't going to get better, and then it did. And this teaches you intuitively not to trust that feeling of hopelessness, of feeling like you're in a tunnel towards doom, to realize that there sometimes are exits, options that you can't see, ways of getting better that you can't anticipate or picture in advance. So as a youth, you don't have that experience, so you're more likely to feel that it's not ever going to get better. And my final risk factor of depression that relates to suicide risk is the hardest of the three to understand in terms of why it relates to suicide risk, and that is not being able to feel pleasure. There's a word for this, anhedonia, based on the root word hedon, hedonism, pleasure. This is the lack of ability to feel pleasure. This also may look like numbness, blankness, feeling empty, which helps us differentiate it from sadness, which is more likely to look like sobbing or be visible outwardly. My explanation of why this relates to suicide risk is summarized in the quote on this slide. I'm not really feeling alive anyway, so not living anymore is not that big of a step. This is why this is important to watch out for. So if you have a youth that used to enjoy certain things and they don't anymore, now maybe their interests have changed, but if they're not enjoying anything anymore, if there doesn't seem to be any way of cheering them up, this might be that they're stuck in this down feeling that is part of this illness of depression. Some behaviors I want you to watch for, especially in youth. One I categorize as escapism. And in that category, I've got substance use and risk-taking behavior and anything that involves using physical sensations, even self-harm, for the purpose of escape. So if you're seeing substance abuse or even getting into fights on purpose, what I want you to pay attention to is the function of it. If they're using substances or risky behaviors to have fun, that may have its own reasons that you might want to address that for the risks that that can lead to, including addictions. But if they're using it to escape their feelings, to numb themselves, to distract themselves, that may be buying into the ultimate idea of escaping feelings entirely by not living anymore. And distraction is the number one coping strategy that I hear about for youth with uncomfortable feelings. And those that cut themselves, well, some cut to feel something when they're feeling nothing, but some cut because they're overwhelmed by their feelings to distract themselves. And that's an understandable coping strategy, like swatting at the bee is understandable, but I would encourage facing feelings, even though that's more uncomfortable. And that's what counseling and therapy is there to support youth in doing, because it's difficult. But that's all why escapism is a risk factor I want you to pay attention to. Something that's more obvious and noticeable is having a meltdown, a breakdown, an outburst, running away, sudden aggression, especially if they hadn't been aggressive before, feeling angry at everyone. What I want you to be careful about here, though, is not that this is as big a risk of suicide as escapism is, but it is a behavior that we're likely to make mistakes about. If the aggression is directed at us, we might get defensive. If they're irritable, we may only notice how they're irritable to us and take it personally. So pay attention in this case to see whether it's a pervasive pattern, that the youth seems to be grumpy with everybody, or the meltdowns or breakdowns that are happening or outbursts are happening seem to be tied to their emotions, overwhelming them and getting out of control. Especially if there didn't seem to be much of a reason for the meltdown, that could be that a lot of that reason is internal. So right when you're saying their feelings unjustified, maybe that should be a sign that it's explained by something inside that may lead eventually to not being able to handle living anymore. And finally, a general category of recklessness with their self, with their possessions, with their status. If they don't seem to care, if they give away their belongings, if they don't seem to care about whether harm comes to them, whether they're embarrassed, especially if they used to care about all those things, that could be a sign that they've made a decision that they're not going to be living anymore so that it doesn't matter. When you see this list of warning signs, what I want you to pay attention to is three things that I've summarized as the 3 C's of using warning sign lists. Change, I've hinted at that the way I was just talking. Whether their behavior or their emotions are a change, if they're cynical, were they always cynical, or are they having that more of that cynical attitude now? If they're withdrawing, is that always been their pattern of being shy, or are they more shy and withdrawn, sort of giving up on social interaction now? And then a combination of symptoms. I would be more concerned if they had two symptoms coming together. So someone whose grades suddenly went down, there might be various reasons for that, but if their grades went down and you're seeing numbness or irritability along with that, then I would be concerned that depression was driving that rather than some academic difficulty. Finally, clarification. If you hear words from youth, and we'll be talking some examples about that coming on an upcoming slide, that concern you, find out what they mean when they say those words. Don't assume that they mean the same thing you would mean by saying those same words. So the example I gave was in the anhedonia, lack of ability to experience pleasure. Clarify whether their interests have changed and they're not a good match for the activities they're doing now, or whether they're just not able to enjoy anything. A list of risk factors is in some ways less important than a list of warning signs, but these risk factors that I'll be talking about are sort of a guide to who to watch more closely. Which youth I would be more concerned about if you saw the same warning signs. So one group of people to watch more closely is those with social factors that might be of a concern, especially people who are not fitting in, who are actively pushed out by their social group. Those aren't necessarily suicidal. There's lots of reactions you can have to that, mainly feeling just sad or left out or angry. But that because that relates to possible worthlessness, they might internalize it, then I would be more concerned, more watchful of that kid. Risks by family or culture. I give one example on the slide that I sort of hinted at already. If parents value the performance of their kids almost exclusively and focus on how well their kids are doing, whether the kids are doing badly or well, praising them only for their achievements might lead the kid to feel valued only for their achievements. One of the first youth that I talked to in my current position almost 7 years ago, who was at risk of suicide, was a star athlete who had gotten injured and felt that their value to their friends and parents was now gone. And especially if the injury might lead to lasting impairment. So be careful when you praise your kids for their performance, not to feed into that. This also feeds into perfectionism, feeling like they need to please you or meet a certain standard. We can set standards for our kids and have them feel hopeful to achieve them without setting them for feeling worthless if they don't measure up. Other risk factors that might be a little more obvious than the one I just talked about, a history of trauma. And I'm defining here, trauma here is not just having something bad happen in your life, but something that was so bad that it overwhelmed your coping strategies. It might have been a danger, it might have been abuse, loss, or neglect. One that's less obvious that I mentioned here is misattunement, where you're brought up by people who just didn't know how to respond to your needs, and thus you didn't learn how to use communication to get your needs met. You gave up hope of getting your needs met, especially emotional needs. But any of those, including being exposed to a disaster, doesn't necessarily lead to suicide risk, but is a risk factor that makes it slightly more likely. Having a history of mental health symptoms, especially for some of your older youth, if there's been a past suicide attempt or hospitalization, that makes it more likely for that pattern to repeat in the future. Youth that are impulsive for any reason, part of their personality or related to ADHD, or that escalate in their emotions quickly, might be more likely to take action on suicidal feelings. These are the youth that sometimes attempt suicide even though they had no previous history of suicidal ideation even. The idea hadn't occurred to them, but as soon as it didn't stew for a while and brew for months and years like it does in most youth. It just, they had an opportunity to act on it and did right away. It was jumping off something, ingesting something. So those that are impulsive are obviously not. So many youth that are impulsive doesn't put them at suicide risk directly, but indirectly it can increase the possibility. And then youth that have experienced a recent change, whether it's a loss, a death in the family, change like divorce, especially anything with a theme of rejection, might make them more likely to internalize that and give up on moving forward and feel like there's no hope or no possibility of happiness for them. Two common risk factors that I want to highlight, that are less about a trait, is more about how they're handling a situation. One is not having the right idea about what suicide is. If they hear about it only through media or movies, they may think that there's some glory in it, that people will learn a lesson if they kill themselves, not realizing that the aftermath of suicide is usually just sadness. I've heard an expression that suicide takes your pain and gives it to someone else, but some people can feel like that, that they may get their name in lights in some way. That's why it's important for you to talk to youth about suicide, to give them a more accurate picture and flesh out their feelings and have them think it through. They may even realize that those ideas don't make sense if they just talk it through. The other major risk factor is where they don't know how to, or feel they can, or feel they should seek help. Now, this is a trait in a lot of adults as well. Cultures and groups that don't value help seeking, that see it as a sign of weakness, are more likely to choose suicide as an option instead if they feel like they can't move forward with their feelings. So you can set an example of making help seeking easy by some of the strategies I'll be talking about in more depth. But just to summarize it now, if you just speak calmly without alarmism or judgment or defensiveness, even if what they're saying they're upset about or triggered by might have to do with you or your leadership role, to just focus on their feelings, including not being judgmental about suicidal thoughts themselves. You obviously don't want to follow them to follow through with a suicidal action, but if you judge a suicidal thought by saying things like, oh, why would you think about suicide when you have so many good things in your life to live for? The person who's suicidal hears that as, you're stupid for having suicide. You should be happier because of all the good things in your life. So you are incorrect. You're wrong for having suicidal feelings. That just makes them feel more flawed, more hopeless. Like, yes, I should be happier, but somehow I'm not. So don't judge by making those kind of statements. Don't feel like you have to fix it or make it right. Talking them through it, especially doing it in a calm way, helps them realize that help seeking is not threatening. I've emphasized calmness because the number one reason youth tell me that they don't tell adults in their lives about their suicidal feelings is not the risk of being judged. That's what I would have guessed before I started doing this work. It is they don't want the adults in their lives to worry about them, to be stressed out. So if you react with alarmism, oh my gosh, oh, I'm so sorry you're feeling that way, they're going to change your mind, deny it, never mind. I don't want you to freak out. I don't want you to be upset. So speaking with curiosity is what I recommend as a replacement for that kind of alarm, that even though it's understandable to feel that. So now we're starting in on how to have the conversation with youth, the words part of the SAW. Some of the words that you may hear that are on the border of being risk statements are these statements that need some clarification, the third of my three C's of using warning signs. If they say, I'm done, this is it. That could mean they're done with life, or that could mean they're done with a situation. So asking them more about what they feel about that what those words mean, how long they've been feeling that way, any statement they made, for some reason I've found asking the question, how long you've been feeling that way, leads to them elaborating a great deal on what they've been feeling, maybe tracing it back to some event, maybe not, but it seems to be a non-threatening question. The other question I have in mind that you can ask is whether those statements have to do with suicide. Now, this may be the most controversial point I make in this whole presentation, is suggesting that you ask that question. I often get concern, maybe even resistance from adults that I train to ask this question of youth because they worry that I'm going to put the idea in their heads when I ask a question about suicide. And think about what you're proposing here, that asking a question like, um, have you been thinking about not wanting to live anymore? Maybe even if you use the word suicide, that a youth is going to say, oh, suicide. I never thought of that option before. Now that you mention it, I'm going to try that. Youth are either already thinking about suicide or they're not, or they're on the verge of it. And you're not likely to put it into their heads for the first time. And if it is their first time hearing about it, you're likely to get some confusion and responding that no, that's not what they're thinking about. So there's not that much risk of asking the question, but there's a lot of risk in not asking that question. A missed opportunity to save a life, even if they weren't at risk of acting on that feeling today, by catching it right when it appears, you may divert them from that path of using suicide as an option for them feeling like they're in that tunnel of doom, for them, that stuck feeling that they're having. A question I get sometimes is, are those statements manipulative? Are they being dramatic? Are they attention seeking? That maybe people are saying this just to get me to worry about them. Well, the key word in that statement I just made is the word just, that they're just attention seeking. They may be attention seeking. In one of the videos that I used to show in high school trainings with students, there was a youth who had said, would you attend my funeral if I killed myself? And you sometimes post alarming things on social media to get support, maybe to get sympathy, but the youth in that video eventually died by suicide. She was dramatic, maybe attention seeking, and also genuinely at risk of killing herself. So don't let the threat manipulate you into doing something you don't feel is right, including for youth staying in relationships that are not healthy, but do take it seriously, do act on it, do get them linked to help, either for the attention seeking or for the genuine suicidal feelings that might accompany that attention seeking. When asking about suicidal feelings, the goal I suggest you have in mind is to make it easier for them to tell you how they're feeling. You may be thinking, and I'll tell you, when I'm interviewing someone about suicide, part of me is saying, please say no, because it's going to be uncomfortable for me to face, even with training, having to do the next steps that might be necessary to save their life, to get them linked to help, especially if they might be resisting that. So even though I don't want them to have that feeling, if they have it, I do want them to be able to tell me. So that's where speaking without judgment, speaking without alarmism is so important. You can ask follow-up questions. If they respond to a question that you ask, like, have you considered not living anymore? You might want to ask, well, if you have considered that, are you considering that today? If you consider not living anymore, the actual picture taking action to die. If you have, picture that, what form of action were you considering? And do you have the means to carry out that action? So, as I've summarized in the last line here, is that an active thought? Is their plan doable? That's questions you can ask to elaborate, to find out more about the feelings, to keep them talking, but also to help you decide how close this is to being a crisis, how soon they need intervention. That was the most important advice to give you. Now I have some situations that may apply to you if you have some of these temptations, which I'm going to assume a lot of us do. It's tempting when someone is down to want to make them feel better with reassuring statements. Now, it's encouragement is fine, the theme of reassurance is fine, but to try to guarantee that things will get better, to try to contradict their statements, if they're saying nobody cares about me, and right face to face with someone who cares about you, to say that I care, that's being honest, that's fine, but doing it to try to talk them out of their feelings is not usually not effective, gets you into a debate, makes them feel like they're wrong for having them feelings. But it is useful to point out the reality of the situation, the options that they have, what's going to happen if they choose certain choices, um, and help them see reality. Like if they say no one cares about me, what do you mean by that? Give examples of how this has happened, that you come to feel this way. That's not talking about it, that's helping them clarify their view of reality. It's tempting, especially if you're uncomfortable, to change the subject. I recommend that you refocus on mastering the subject. Distraction, as I mentioned before, is tempting to escape from pain, to escape from dealing with the pain right now. It's okay to talk about the future or try to talk about the future, partly as a way of finding out whether they have that hopelessness symptom that I mentioned earlier. But to dodge the subject, to drop the subject just because you or they are uncomfortable, you may just missed an opportunity, not only that day, but in the future, because they may take that as a sign that you don't want to talk about those things. You're going to change the subject, so they won't even begin to talk to you about them next time. So if there are uncomfortable feelings, sit with them through those uncomfortable feelings, and if necessary, help them get to some treatment. The kind of statement I made earlier about look at all the good things you have to live for in life is one of what I call magic wand statements. Statements we make wishing that they made the feelings go away. The most common example of this is when someone is really worried about something or tempted to say, "Don't worry, I'm sure everything will turn out fine." Now picture you were worried when I made that statement. Did I just make your worries go away? More likely, I made you feel like this is not someone I can talk to about my worries. He doesn't get it. He thinks I can just make my worries go away. If you feel differently than they do, it's okay to tell them that. If they ask for options and suggestions of how to think or how to act, then it's okay to provide them. But to tell them how to think and how to feel is more likely to make them feel judged. Therapy is not about turning feelings around directly with a magic wand statement, although therapists wish they had one too. It's about helping the youth work through their feelings, face reality, and eventually come to a different understanding, a different set of options of how to move forward. Your job, not as a therapist, but as a youth leader, can be just to sit with them through the feelings, sort them out, and maybe if the feelings are really strong for them in that moment, sit until the feelings exhaust themselves. Whether it's panic or sadness or depression, sometimes the body only can keep doing it so long unless someone keeps the fires burning by trying to fight with them about how they're feeling. Just try to understand. And about that understanding, it's tempting to say, "I understand how you feel." Rather than claiming that you understand, claiming empathy, Do empathy. Empathy is a process. It's not about saying you understand, it's about trying to understand by being curious, by talking things through. Even if you've been in the exact same situation of that youth, even if you think you felt the exact same thing as that youth, they're not going to see it that way. And most likelihood, you haven't. Even if you've been through the same situation, your culture, background, emotional makeup, personality might lead you to react differently than that person is in that same situation. So your default assumption should be, I don't understand how you feel. Help me understand. Explain it to me more. It's also tempting to give advice. In a way, some of the things I've talked about already can be considered in the advice category. When someone finds out that I've worked as a therapist, they sometimes say, what advice do you have for? And I pause them there because therapy is about leading to your own solutions, not telling them what solutions they should have. Now, if someone asks for advice, it's okay to give them options, but to focus on just describing what you're noticing, acknowledging what they're going through, uh, talking talking it through. It's time for one of my slogans: keep them talking to keep them living, rather than feeling like you need to make it go away with advice or reassurance or magic wand statements. The final step in this process is what to do if it becomes more than just a conversation between you and that youth, where they might need counseling either immediately or eventually. I like to think of this as expanding the team, because if you think of it as referring, one of the trainings I do is question, persuade, refer. Uh, it can seem like you're handing it off to someone else. And to youth, that can feel like abandonment if they feel like you're overwhelmed and so you need to get them sent off to a counselor. I do want you to take action exactly when you're feeling overwhelmed, but think of it as expanding your team, of bringing someone in to the situation to help you deal with the youth, and expanding the youth's team, bringing someone in their corner who can help them sort out their feelings, help them strategize, help them de-escalate and calm down. So have that in mind, where if you need help helping the youth, or if they seem to need help, that your presence is not enough to provide, rather than seeing that as an insult to your capacity to help, see it as part of your helping skill to know when to expand the team and get other people involved. While you're doing so, stay with the youth until the helping person arrives, and even while the helping person is there, so that it doesn't feel like you're dumping them on someone else. Um, as far as parent involvement is concerned, do inform parents of what's going on if it feels like it's safe to do so. But in the case of a crisis, don't wait for parent involvement before taking action. Now, if you feel like you have the capacity to keep the youth safe, that there's not any means that they have to take action on their suicidal feelings, then um, it could be, it certainly can be okay to wait and wait with them. But if there's an action that needs to be taken, um, including ones that you would like the parent permission from, like taking a weapon away from a knife away or other weapon away from the youth, um, or some other referring to counseling, bringing in a crisis counselor, try to involve the parents, but take action when you need to. And in terms of inviting professionals involved, people watching this video are in various different locations. There are local crisis lines, usually at the county level. There's usually a county mental health agency that has the responsibility for managing a crisis service. So get to know that line in your county. That's the most direct path to getting someone who can call in or come out. And there are other options for getting someone else involved to talk the youth through their feelings. One is a crisis text line where you text the number 741 741, and even though that's not a full 10 digits, as soon as you type in those numbers, it'll pop up with a hyphen between the two 741s, and you can then text a message saying, I'm here with this youth. I don't know what to do. I'm going to hand the phone over to them. Sometimes youth are more comfortable texting than being in a phone call, feels less pressured. And that texting conversation may eventually lead to a referral to other follow-up, but sometimes it can be a useful step in the middle. And there's a suicide prevention lifeline. If you don't know the local lifeline, it's 1-800-273-TALK. Now, eventually, that lifeline, by act of legislation in Congress that was passed last year, is going to be just simply dialing 988. It's going to be the new 911, but for mental health crises. It'll reach most states and most counties in the United States by 2022. In some places, it's rolling out maybe even later this year. That was a whirlwind tour of how to notice warning signs in youth and how to take action. If you have issues specific to your situation, I hope you have the support to follow up on that. If you have more general questions about the kind of strategies I talked about, my email address is here on this slide. It's on the first slide for those getting a copy of the handouts. I hope you now feel, especially after digesting this a little bit, more ready, having more options, more guidelines about what to notice, what attitudes to take, and how to respond if you are in the presence of a youth who might be at eventual risk of suicide. Thanks again, and good luck in your work. Thanks for helping care for our youth.